They called him a liar. They called him a demon-touched child. They drove him into the wilderness with nothing but a wool blanket and a small sack of cornmeal. He was 11 years old. 6 months later, those same people would kneel at the entrance of his cave, begging to be let inside. The morning of September 29th, 1886, dawned cold and gray over Briarwood, Wyoming territory. The aspens on the hillsides had just begun their autumn transformation, their leaves edged with gold, trembling in a wind that carried the first true bite of the coming season. It was the kind of morning that made sensible people check their woodpiles and count their preserved goods. It was the kind of morning that whispered of changes to come. Ezra Jessup stood at the edge of town with his feet planted in the dirt road that led north into the foothills. He was small for his age, with dark hair that his father used to cut with hunting shears, and eyes the color of winter storms. Those eyes held a quality that had always unsettled the adults of Briarwood. They were too old for his face, too knowing, too still. Behind him, the people of the town had gathered in doorways and on porches, watching with the particular cruelty that fear wears when it disguises itself as righteousness. No one waved. No one called out a kindness. No one offered a word of comfort to the child they were sending to die. The wool blanket over his thin shoulders had been his mother's. She had died bringing him into the world, and the blanket still carried a faint scent of lavender that Ezra could detect if he pressed his face into the worn fabric. The cornmeal in his sack would last perhaps a week if he was careful. The clothes on his back were patched and mended, hand-me-downs that had never quite fit. This was all he had. This was all they had given him. 3 days earlier, Ezra had stood in Olson's general store, surrounded by the smell of coffee beans and leather and the particular mustiness of dry goods stored too long. He had not planned to speak. He had learned years ago that speaking brought him nothing but trouble. But the signs had been too clear, too urgent, too impossible to ignore. The beavers on Miller Creek had built their dams 3 feet higher than any year Ezra could remember. The elk had begun moving down from the high country a full month ahead of schedule. Their coats already thick with winter fur, their eyes nervous with an instinct older than memory. The woolly bear caterpillars were almost entirely black, their orange bands reduced to mere threads. The squirrels gathered with a desperation that spoke of deep knowing. His father had taught him to read these signs. His father had taught him that the animals always knew. So Ezra had spoken. "The winter is coming early," he had said, his voice cutting through the comfortable chatter of the store. Every head had turned. Every eye had fixed on the strange orphan boy who never quite fit, never quite belonged, never quite became the grateful child they expected him to be. "It will be the worst winter anyone has ever seen. The snow will bury the houses. The cold will kill the cattle. If you do not prepare now, many will die." The silence that followed had been absolute. Then Mrs. Prudence Olson, wife of the store's owner and unofficial carrier of all Briarwood's gossip, had let out a sound that was half laugh, half gasp of horror. "Poor thing," she had said, shaking her head with theatrical sympathy. "The boy's mind has been troubled ever since his father passed. All that time alone in the mountains, with only a madman for company. It's a wonder he can speak at all." Dr. Cornelius Webb had stepped forward, adjusting his spectacles with the particular self-importance of educated men in small towns. He was 42 years old, trained in medicine at a college back east, and he considered himself the sole voice of reason in a community of superstitious farmers and ranchers. "There is no scientific basis for such claims," he had pronounced, as if speaking to a classroom of slow children. "Weather prediction is the province of instruments and observation, not the fevered imaginings of an orphan boy. This is nothing but the superstition of mountain people, and we would do well to dismiss it entirely." Jedediah Pike, the blacksmith, had laughed outright. He was 35, broad-shouldered, quick with a joke, and quicker with mockery. "The boy's building himself a grave before he's even dead," he had declared to general amusement. "Maybe we should take up a collection for his headstone." The laughter had spread through the store like fire through dry grass. Only 3 faces had not joined in. Old Ephraim Morrison, 72 years old and the oldest resident of Briarwood, had watched Ezra with eyes that held something like recognition. Tobias Mercer, 14 and the son of a rancher, had looked at the floor, his fists clenched at his sides. And Temperance Thornwood, wife of the Reverend, too, had pressed her hand to her heart and looked away, as if the sight of the boy caused her physical pain. But their silence had meant nothing against the rising tide of scorn. By evening, Reverend Obadiah Thornwood had called a meeting in the church. He was 55 years old, with a voice like thunder and eyes like chips of flint. He had led Briarwood's congregation for 20 years, and in that time he had come to see himself not merely as a spiritual guide, but as the moral authority of the entire territory. What Obadiah Thornwood declared from his pulpit became truth. What he condemned was condemned, and he had condemned Ezra Jessup. "No child can know such things," he had thundered, his finger pointing at the small figure standing alone before the altar. "No natural child, no godly child. This is the work of darkness. And while this boy speaks with the voice of the deceiver, spreading fear to serve Satan's purposes, he is either possessed by demons or simply wicked, and in either case, he must be cast out before his corruption spreads to our children, our families, our community." Thaddeus Harrigan, owner of the largest ranch in the district, had risen to add his voice. He was 48 years old, wealthy by frontier standards, and accustomed to being heard. "I've lived in this territory for 30 years, he had declared. "Wyoming winters can be harsh, but no child can see the future. This is nonsense at best, dangerous hysteria at worst. I say we send him away before he infects others with his madness." The vote had been 47 in favor of exile, 3 against: old Ephraim Morrison, Tobias Mercer, and one woman whose name was never recorded had voted to let the boy stay. Their votes had been noted, and their neighbors had looked at them with new suspicion. Now, standing at the edge of town with everything he owned, Ezra did not look back. Looking back was for people who had something to return to. He had never had much of anything, and what little he had possessed, they had taken from him. But before he could take his first step into the wilderness, a hand caught his arm. Tobias Mercer had approached from the side, moving quickly, checking over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching too closely. He was 4 years older than Ezra, tall for his age, with the calloused hands of a boy who had worked cattle since he could walk. His father owned one of the larger ranches in the district, and Tobias had everything that Ezra lacked: a home, a family, a future. Yet here he was, pressing something into Ezra's hand. It was a hunting knife. The blade was 8 inches long, the handle worn smooth by years of use, the edge honed sharp enough to split a hair. It had belonged to Tobias's father, passed down from grandfather to grandson, and it was worth more than everything Ezra had ever owned combined. "I don't believe them," Tobias whispered fiercely. "My father says old Ephraim remembers a winter that killed 200 people back in '56. He says the old man knows things. And you know things too. I can see it." Ezra looked at the knife, then at the boy who was risking his father's anger and his neighbor's scorn to offer this gift. "You'll survive," Tobias continued. "I know you will. And when you're proven right, I'll find you. I swear it." Then he was gone, a melting back into the watching crowd before anyone could notice their exchange. Ezra slipped the knife into his belt, feeling its weight against his hip like a promise. He took one step forward, then another. The road stretched before him, winding north toward the foothills, toward the high country where his father had once roamed, toward a wilderness that killed most men who dared to challenge it. He was 11 years old. He was alone, and he was walking toward either death or survival, with nothing in between. But before the town disappeared behind the first ridge, one more voice reached him. Old Ephraim Morrison had positioned himself at the very edge of the gathered crowd, leaning on his walking stick, his weathered face unreadable. As Ezra passed, the old man spoke quietly, his words meant for the boy's ears alone. "In 1856, he said, snow buried the church steeple. I was the only one in my family of 7 who survived. I was 12 years old." Ezra stopped but did not turn. "You know something they don't know, boy. I can see it in you, same as I saw it in myself all those years ago. Go north. There are sandstone cliffs where the hills meet the valley. Your father knew that country. You'll know it too." Then even more quietly, "When they come looking, and they will come looking, remember that the choice to help is always yours. The mountains will teach you to survive. Only you can decide what kind of person you want to be. Ezra nodded once, a small movement that the old man acknowledged with his own slight inclination of the head. Then the boy continued walking, and the town of Briarwood disappeared behind him. And he was alone with the wind and the wilderness and the knowledge that burned in his chest like a coal that refused to die. Silas Jessup had been a trapper and a hunter, a man more comfortable in the company of mountains than in the company of other men. His own father had come from the Scottish Highlands, carrying with him stories of winters that could kill a man between one heartbeat and the next, and wisdom about reading the land that stretched back generations beyond counting. That wisdom had passed from grandfather to father to son, a chain of knowledge forged in the cold places of the world where survival was never guaranteed and death waited in every shadow. Silas had taught Ezra to read the signs from the time the boy could walk. They had spent seasons together in the high country, following trap lines, hunting deer and elk, sleeping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Silas had shown his son how to determine winter's severity by the thickness of a caterpillar's coat. He had explained how the height of beaver dams predicted coming snow depth. He had taught the boy to watch the elk and deer, to notice when they moved and where they gathered, to understand that the animals knew things that humans had forgotten. Nature never lies, Silas had told his son on 100 different occasions. Only people lie. And when people refuse to listen, nature teaches them the hard way, the expensive way, the way that fills graveyards. Ezra had absorbed these lessons like soil absorbs rain. By the time he was 7, he could predict weather patterns 3 days in advance. By 9, he could read an approaching storm in the behavior of birds and the quality of light on distant peaks. He had become, in his father's words, a true child of the mountains. Then the mountains had taken Silas away. It happened in the summer of 1884, in a canyon above the Sweetwater River, where the grizzlies came to fish for salmon. Silas had gone to check his trap lines alone, leaving Ezra at their base camp with instructions to keep the fire burning and the food secured. He had not returned that night, or the next night, or the night after that. On the 4th morning, Ezra had followed the ravens. The birds had led him to a clearing where the grass was stained dark, and the air held a copper smell that the boy recognized from butchering deer. His father lay face down near a fallen log, his body broken, his rifle unfired, his hunting knife still in its sheath. The grizzly had come upon him quickly, silently, giving him no chance to defend himself. Ezra had stood over his father's body for a long time. He had not cried. He had not screamed. He had simply stood there, feeling something fundamental shift inside his chest. Some childish part of him dying alongside the only person who had ever truly understood him. Then he had taken his father's knife, and he had begun to dig. It took him 2 days to carve a grave deep enough in that rocky soil. His hands blistered and bled and blistered again. His arms ached until they felt like they might fall off. But he did not stop. He could not stop. This was the last thing he could do for the man who had given him everything. When the grave was finished, and Ezra had lowered his father into the earth and covered him with stones to keep the animals away, he had stood at the head of the grave with the sun setting behind the mountains, and he had made a promise. "I will remember everything you taught me," he had said, his voice steady despite the devastation in his heart. "I will survive, and I will make sure that what you knew doesn't die with you." Then he had walked to Briarwood, the nearest settlement, hoping to find some kind of life among people. He had been 9 years old. He had been utterly alone, and he had carried with him a weight of knowledge that would eventually get him cast out like a leper. If you're watching this story today, I'd love to know where you're joining from. Whether you're in the mountains, the plains, or somewhere the winters cut just as deep, these lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you've ever been punished for telling a truth that others didn't want to hear, share your story in the comments. Now back to Ezra and his journey into the wilderness. The walk north took 2 days. Ezra moved at a steady pace, eating his cornmeal sparingly, sleeping in the shelter of fallen logs with his blanket wrapped tight against the October chill. He was not afraid of the wilderness. The wilderness had been his first home, and unlike the people of Briarwood, it did not judge him. It did not call him names or question his sanity. It simply existed, beautiful and terrible, and utterly indifferent to human concerns. As he walked, he continued to read the signs. The beaver dams along the upper creek were even higher than he had reported in the store. The animals were working with a desperate urgency that spoke of deep instinct, of knowledge encoded in their very bones. They knew what was coming. They were preparing for a winter that would test the limits of survival. The elk were everywhere, moving in herds down from the high country, their breath steaming in the cold air, their coats already thick enough for December. They should not have been this low for another month. Their early migration confirmed what the beavers had shown, what the caterpillars had predicted, what every sign in nature was screaming to anyone willing to listen. A killing winter was coming, the worst in living memory, perhaps the worst in the history of this territory, and Ezra was walking into it alone. On the second day, he found the cliffs that old Ephraim had mentioned. They rose from the sagebrush flats like the walls of some ancient fortress, 40 feet of red gold sandstone layered and fractured by millions of years of wind and water. A small valley opened at their base, sheltered from the worst of the north wind, fed by a spring that emerged from the rock face and tumbled down to form a clear pool before disappearing into the earth. Ezra stood at the edge of this valley and felt something loosen in his chest. He knew this place, not from memory exactly, but from something deeper. His father had spoken of sandstone cliffs where the rock was soft enough to carve, but hard enough to last. He had described springs that never froze because they emerged from deep within the earth, where the temperature remained constant regardless of the season. This was the place. This would be his home. He spent the first day exploring. The cliff face held a natural overhang that provided shelter from rain and snow, and beneath this overhang, Ezra found what he was looking for. A crack in the rock, a natural fissure that ran back into the cliff, just wide enough for a small body to squeeze through. It led to a cavity within the stone, a pocket of darkness perhaps 10 feet deep and 8 feet wide. It was not a home, not yet, but it could become one. The next morning, Ezra began to carve. His father had taught him about sandstone. It was a forgiving rock, soft enough to work with simple tools, hard enough to stand against the elements once properly shaped. Silas had shown his son how ancient peoples had carved homes into cliffs not unlike these, creating dwellings that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter, and that stood for centuries after the builders had turned to dust. Now Ezra would put that knowledge to use. The first week was the hardest. His hands, already calloused from years of outdoor work, blistered anyway. The blisters broke and bled. The blood dried and cracked. New blisters formed beneath the old wounds. His arms ached from shoulder to fingertip. His back screamed in protest each morning when he rose to work again. But he did not stop. He used his father's knife as a primary tool, scraping and chipping at the sandstone with patient determination. He gathered flat rocks from the valley floor and shaped them into crude chisels. He found harder stones that served as hammers, driving his makeshift tools into the rock face, breaking away chunks of sandstone that accumulated in piles at his feet. Each day, the cavity grew a little larger. Each day, the entrance widened and the interior deepened. Each day, the shape of a dwelling emerged from the raw stone. By the end of the second week, Ezra had expanded the natural cavity into something approaching a room. The entrance now measured 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall, easy enough to pass through without stooping too much. The interior had grown to 12 feet deep and 10 feet wide, with a ceiling that peaked at 7 feet, following the natural grain of the stone. He carved a fire pit near the entrance, positioning it beneath a natural crack in the rock that served as a chimney. The first time he lit a fire, the smoke rose straight up and out, drawn by the draft that flowed through the fissure. The heat from the flames was absorbed by the surrounding stone, which then radiated warmth throughout the night, keeping the interior comfortable even as temperatures outside dropped below freezing. His father had taught him this, the principle of thermal mass, of using stone to store and release heat. The ancient peoples had known it. The mountain peoples of Europe had known it. And now Ezra knew it, and that knowledge would save his life. The work continued through October. Ezra fell into a rhythm that organized his days with military precision. Dawn brought labor on the cave, carving and shaping and smoothing the stone until his arms could no longer lift his tools. Then he would turn to the business of survival, checking the snares he had set for rabbits, gathering the nuts and roots and late berries that the land still offered, collecting firewood against the coming cold. He caught rabbits with techniques his father had taught him before he was old enough to read. Simple snares of twisted grass, positioned along runs where the animals traveled, baited with bits of root or dried grass. The rabbits provided meat and fur, protein to keep his body working, and material that he scraped and cured and stored away. He gathered pine nuts from the trees that dotted the valley, shaking the cones and picking out the small, oily seeds that were rich in fat and calories. He collected rose hips from the wild bushes along the creek, drying them for tea that would provide vitamin C through the winter months. He dug roots that could be roasted in the coals, starchy tubers that his father had shown him how to identify, test, and prepare. By the end of October, Ezra had accumulated enough food to last a month. It was not enough. It would never be enough if the winter proved as harsh as he expected. But it was a start, and each day brought more. If you're enjoying this story about Ezra and his stone home, tap that like button right now. It's free, takes just a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to hear it. Now back to the story, because something is about to happen that will change everything. The wolves came on a night in early November, when the first serious cold had settled over the valley and the stars burned with the particular brightness that only clear, frigid air could produce. Ezra had built up his fire and retreated into his cave. The wooden door he had constructed from fallen aspen logs secured against the entrance. He was drifting towards sleep when he heard the first howl, close and sharp and hungry. And then came another howl, and another, and another, until the night seemed filled with the voices of predators. Ezra grabbed his knife and pressed his back against the stone wall, watching the door, listening to the sounds outside, scratching at the wood, sniffing at the gaps, the low, rumbling growls of animals that smelled food and warmth and vulnerability. The wolves worked at his door for hours. They dug at its base. They threw their weight against the logs. They circled the cliff face, looking for other entrances, other weaknesses, other ways to reach the prey they knew was hiding inside. Ezra did not sleep. He sat with his knife ready and his fire burning high, feeding the flames with precious wood that he had gathered through weeks of patient work. The fire was his only weapon. Wolves feared fire. All predators feared fire. And as long as the flames burned, he had a chance. Dawn came gray and cold, and the wolves retreated with the growing light. Ezra opened his door cautiously, knife ready, expecting to find the animals waiting just out of sight. Instead, he found a single wolf lying in the snow near the spring. It was a female, her gray fur matted with blood, her side torn by what looked like the marks of another wolf's teeth. She had been injured in a fight, probably over food or position in the pack, and she had been left behind when the others departed. Now she lay in the snow, her breath coming in short, pained gasps, her eyes watching Ezra with the flat regard of a predator who knows she is dying. Ezra could have killed her easily. One thrust of his knife would have ended her suffering and provided him with valuable fur and meat. It would have been the practical choice, the survival choice, the choice his father might have made without hesitation. Instead, Ezra built a small fire near the spring, melted snow for water, and approached the injured wolf with slow, careful movements. She growled when he came close, a warning that had no strength behind it. He ignored the sound and knelt beside her, examining the wound on her side. It was deep but not fatal, the kind of injury that would kill through infection, rather than blood loss. He cleaned the wound with water from the spring. He packed it with a poultice of moss and herbs that his father had taught him to use for his own cuts and scrapes. He wrapped the wolf's side with strips torn from his mother's blanket, sacrificing warmth to save a creature that had tried to kill him mere hours before. The wolf watched him throughout the process, her golden eyes tracking his every movement. She did not bite. She did not struggle. It was as if she understood that this human, this strange, small human who lived in the rocks, was trying to help rather than harm. When the bandaging was complete, Ezra retreated to his cave and left food, dried rabbit meat, within the wolf's reach. He watched from his doorway as she struggled to her feet, ate the offering, and limped away into the trees. She paused at the edge of the forest and looked back. For a long moment, human and wolf regarded each other across the snow. Then she was gone, disappeared into the wilderness, and Ezra was alone again. He did not know why he had helped her. Perhaps it was compassion. Perhaps it was some instinct that recognized kinship with another creature that had been abandoned by its pack. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that survival in this harsh land required something more than ruthlessness, that mercy was its own form of strength. Whatever the reason, he had made a choice. And choices, as his father had often said, had consequences that rippled outward in ways no one could predict. The horse appeared a week later. Ezra had expanded his cave to include a second chamber, smaller than the first, intended for storage. He was returning from checking his trap lines when he saw the animal standing near the spring, drinking from the pool with desperate thirst. It was a Mustang, a stallion the color of morning mist, with a coat that seemed to shift between gray and silver, depending on how the light struck it. See, his mane and tail were tangled with burrs and twigs, and his ribs showed clearly beneath his hide. But it was his right rear leg that told the real story. The leg was swollen and hot, injured badly enough that the horse could barely put weight on it. He had been separated from his herd, probably during a chase by wolves or mountain lions. The injury had slowed him, made him vulnerable, forced him to leave his companions behind. Now he stood alone in this small valley, drinking water, waiting for death to find him. Ezra watched from the trees for a long time. A horse would change everything. A horse could carry supplies, could help with heavy work, could provide transportation if escape ever became necessary. A horse could mean the difference between survival and starvation in the months to come. But a wild horse could also kill an 11-year-old boy with a single kick. Mustangs were not gentle creatures. They had survived for generations by running from every threat, fighting when cornered, trusting nothing that walked on two legs. Ezra began the process of gaining trust. On the first day, he simply sat at the edge of the valley, in plain sight but far enough away that the horse did not feel threatened. He sat for hours, not moving, not approaching, just being present. The horse watched him nervously at first, ready to bolt despite his injury. But as the hours passed and the human made no threatening moves, some of that tension eased. On the second day, Ezra sat a little closer. He brought a handful of dried grass, the kind the horse would find in the valley, and he left it on a rock before retreating to his previous position. Where the horse approached the offering cautiously, sniffed it, ate it. Then he looked at the human with something that might have been curiosity. On the third day, closer still, more grass, more waiting, more of the patient process of building trust that could not be rushed, could not be forced, could only be earned through time and consistency. By the end of the second week, the horse would approach Ezra voluntarily, sniffing his hands, accepting the food he offered, allowing the boy to touch his neck and run fingers through his tangled mane. And by then, Ezra had also been treating the injured leg, cleaning it, packing it with the same poultices he had used on the wolf, wrapping it in cloth to keep the wound protected. The leg healed slowly but steadily. The horse grew stronger as Ezra brought him food and water. When, as the stress of fleeing predators gave way to the calm of this sheltered valley with its strange, gentle human inhabitant. Ezra named him Ghost, for the color of his coat and for the silent way he appeared and disappeared in the morning mist that rose from the spring. He converted the second chamber of his cave into a stable, expanding it enough to accommodate the horse comfortably. Ghost's body heat added warmth to the entire cave system, a benefit Ezra had not anticipated. And his presence provided something else entirely: companionship. Ezra found himself talking to the horse as he worked, sharing his thoughts and fears and memories in a way he had never shared with any human. Ghost would listen with ears pricked forward, occasionally nuzzling Ezra's shoulder or making the soft, whickering sounds that the boy came to recognize as affection. "You and I are the same," Ezra told him one evening, as autumn deepened toward winter. "Abandoned by our kind, left to die alone. But we didn't die, did we? We found each other instead." Ghost nickered softly in response, and for the first time since his father's death, Ezra felt something like peace. Meanwhile, in Briarwood, life continued as if nothing unusual had happened. The autumn had been mild so far, the weather pleasant, the harvest adequate. Reverend Obadiah Thornwood preached sermons of thanksgiving, congratulating his congregation on their wisdom in casting out the demon-touched boy who had tried to spread fear among them. God had rewarded their faith with good weather and good fortune. Walk the darkness has been driven from our midst, he thundered from his pulpit. The deceiver's tool has been cast into the wilderness where such creatures belong. And see how the Lord has blessed us. See how our righteousness has been rewarded. Thaddeus Harrigan counted his cattle with satisfaction. The herd had grown fat on summer grass, and the calves born in spring were healthy and strong. He had more than enough feed to carry them through the winter, more than enough animals to sell in spring for a handsome profit. If that boy's terrible winter comes, he said in the saloon, to general laughter, I'll personally ride out and bring him back. I'll build him a house with my own hands. Doctor. Cornelius Webb treated his patients for the usual autumn complaints and assured everyone that there was no scientific evidence for unusual weather patterns. The boy had been mentally disturbed, nothing more. His predictions were fantasy, the product of an unbalanced mind corrupted by too much time in the wilderness. Jedediah Pike at the blacksmith forge made jokes about betting on the boy's survival. $5 says he's already dead, he offered, and found plenty of takers. 10 says we find his body come spring, if the animals leave enough to find. Only 3 people in Briarwood seemed troubled. Old Ephraim Morrison sat on his porch each morning, watching the sky with eyes that had seen 7 decades of Wyoming weather. He noticed the birds leaving early, the squirrels gathering with unusual urgency, watched the quality of light that seemed wrong for the season. He had tried to warn Dr. Webb. 1856 started just like this, he had said. Pleasant autumn, mild weather, everyone comfortable and confident. Then the snow came, and it didn't stop coming for 3 months. Dr. Webb had patted his arm with condescending sympathy. The mind plays tricks as we age, Mr. Morrison. I'm sure it felt like 3 months, but historical records show nothing unusual about that winter. Ephraim had said nothing more, but he had quietly begun to stockpile food and firewood, preparing for the possibility that an 11-year-old boy might be right and every adult in town might be wrong. Temperance Thornwood found herself drawn to the window each evening, gazing north toward the foothills where the boy had gone. She had not voted with the crowd that condemned him. She had not raised her voice in his defense either, and that silence haunted her. Each night she prayed for the boy's soul, asking God to protect a child that she herself had failed to protect. Each night she added a little more to her own secret store of supplies, hidden in the back of her pantry where her husband would not find them. And Tobias Mercer could not stop thinking about the knife he had given away. His father had noticed its absence, had questioned him, had accepted his stammered explanation that he must have lost it somewhere on the range. The lie sat heavy in Tobias's chest, not because he regretted giving the knife to Ezra, but because he feared his father would learn the truth. Still, when he lay awake at night, he hoped the knife was being put to good use. He hoped the strange, silent boy with the knowing eyes was out there somewhere, surviving against all odds, proving everyone wrong. November brought the first cold snap, a week of temperatures that dropped well below freezing, with frost coating the windows each morning and ice forming on the horse troughs overnight. The people of Briarwood huddled closer to their fires and reassured each other that this was normal, that Wyoming winters were always harsh, that there was nothing to worry about. Then November 12th arrived. The snow began falling at dawn, soft and heavy, the kind of wet snow that accumulated quickly and stuck to everything it touched. By noon, the wind had picked up, driving the flakes horizontally through the air. By evening, visibility had dropped to less than 50 feet, and the temperature had plunged to 20 below zero. In his cave high in the foothills, Ezra watched the storm through a gap in his wooden door. Ghost stood beside him, nickering nervously, sensing the change in pressure, the electricity in the air that spoke of something vast and terrible descending upon the land. It's starting, Ezra said quietly, just like I said it would. The snow did not stop. This is the moment where everything changes. If this story is resonating with you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the devastating conclusion. Now back to Briarwood, where the people who cast out an 11-year-old boy are about to learn the cost of their arrogance. For 9 days, the storm raged without pause. The wind howled at 50 miles per hour, and were driving snow into drifts that climbed higher and higher against every obstacle. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there. The sky remained an unbroken wall of gray, day and night blending together in an endless twilight of falling white. In Briarwood, 20 miles to the south, disaster unfolded exactly as Ezra had predicted. The cattle died first. Thaddeus Harrigan watched in horror as his prize herd, the foundation of his wealth and his pride, simply ceased to exist. The animals had been grazing in the lower pastures when the storm hit, and they had no shelter, no protection, no chance. The first 50 died in the opening hours, freezing in the draws and coulees where they had sought inadequate refuge from the wind. By the third day, Harrigan had lost 400 head. By the end of the week, when the number had climbed past 1,000, the cattle that did not freeze starved, unable to find food beneath the mounting snow, too weak to dig through the drifts to reach the grass below. The Mercer Ranch lost 300 cattle. The Peterson spread lost 200. Across the valley, the beef that had been the foundation of Briarwood's economy simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but frozen carcasses that the wolves and coyotes would feast on come spring. Then the food ran out. Olson's General Store, which had seemed adequately stocked in October, was nearly empty by Christmas. The families who had entered winter with confidence found their larders depleted, their preserved goods consumed, their options narrowing with each passing day. Hunters ventured out to find game and came back empty-handed, their faces frost-bitten, their spirits broken. The deer and elk had moved to lower elevations weeks before, and the rabbits had burrowed so deep that even experienced trappers could not find them. By January, Briarwood was starving. The first human death was Ezekiel Morrison, Ephraim's younger brother, 68 years old and weakened by a lifetime of hard work. He had gone to fetch firewood from the pile beside his house, a distance of perhaps 30 feet. He never made it back. His wife found his body the next morning, frozen solid, his hands still reaching toward the door. 30 feet. That was all the distance between life and death in this killing cold. Dr. Webb diagnosed the cause as exposure and hypothermia, as if giving the death a medical name somehow made it less horrifying. He recorded it in his ledger and moved on to the next patient, refusing to acknowledge that everything he had dismissed as superstition was proving terribly, inescapably true. The children began to sicken next. Without adequate food, their small bodies could not fight the illnesses that winter brought. The Henderson baby, 8 months old, developed a fever that no amount of cool cloths could break. She died in her mother's arms on a night when the wind screamed like a living thing outside the window, and her father Thomas went out to dig a grave in frozen ground, in the dark, in a storm that seemed determined to kill everyone it touched. He came back with frost-bitten hands and a grave that was too shallow, hacked into the unyielding earth with more desperation than skill. They buried the baby at dawn and retreated to their house to wait for the next death. It came 3 weeks later, when Thomas Henderson went out to fetch wood, just as Ezekiel Morrison had done. The woodpile was 20 feet from his door. He had made the trip 100 times since the storm began. This time he got lost. The snow was falling so thick, the wind blowing so hard that he could not find his way back. 20 feet from safety, he wandered in circles, his voice swallowed by the storm, his tracks filling in almost as fast as he made them. When Verity Henderson finally found the courage to open the door and search for him, she found nothing but white. His body was discovered 3 months later, when the snow finally began to melt. He had died 20 feet from his own door, one hand stretched toward a house he could not see, could not reach, could not find. Verity did not cry when they told her. She had no tears left. Her baby was dead. Her husband was dead, and she had to keep living, keep surviving, keep drawing breath in a world that seemed determined to take everything from her. Jedediah Pike lost 2 fingers to frostbite. He had stepped outside to check the condition of his forge, a walk of 50 feet that took him 3 minutes. When he returned, his right hand was white and waxy, the flesh already dying. Dr. Webb amputated the fingers with a saw and whiskey, and Jedediah never made another joke about betting on the death of children. By February, Briarwood had lost 23 souls, 11 men, 4 women, 8 children. The youngest was the Henderson baby. The oldest was Ezekiel Morrison. And more were dying every week, claimed by cold or hunger, or the despair that settled over the town like a second winter. The Reverend continued to preach. "This is a test of faith," Obadiah Thornwood thundered from his pulpit. His congregation reduced by death and weakness, but still obedient, still desperate for answers that made sense. God is trying us as he tried Job. We must remain steadfast. But hope was in short supply, and faith could not fill empty bellies or warm frozen hands. It was Tobias Mercer who finally spoke the name that everyone had been avoiding. He stood before the emergency council that had gathered in the Harrigan house, the largest structure still standing. The only place warm enough to hold a meeting. Tobias was 15 now, aged beyond his years by a winter that had taken his father, who had frozen to death searching for a lost calf. "Ezra Jessup," he said, and the name fell into the room like a stone into still water. "The boy we sent away. The boy who warned us about this. My father told me before he died. He said to find the Jessup boy. He said the boy knew things." Silence followed. Then Thaddeus Harrigan cleared his throat. "The boy is dead," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No child could survive alone in this." "His father survived alone for a year," old Ephraim replied from his corner. "And the boy is his father's son. I told him where to go. If he found those cliffs, if he had time to prepare, he might still be alive." "Even if he is," Dr. Webb interrupted, "what could a child possibly offer us?" "He knew this winter was coming," Tobias shot back. "He knew it 6 weeks before it started. What else does he know that we dismissed because we were too proud to listen to an 11-year-old orphan?" Another silence. Then Temperance Thornwood spoke from the doorway. "If the boy's alive, he might know where to find food. He might have shelter. He might be our only chance." Reverend Thornwood turned to his wife with fury in his eyes. "You would have us beg mercy from the very child I condemned?" "I would have us live," Temperance replied. "I would have our children live. If that means begging mercy from a boy we wronged, then yes, I would beg. Wouldn't you?" The Reverend had no answer. A search party was organized. 5 men on the strongest remaining horses, carrying what little food could be spared for a journey that might take days. Tobias Mercer insisted on leading the group. Thaddeus Harrigan joined out of guilt, or perhaps hope. Jedediah Pike came despite his missing fingers, his hands wrapped in thick bandages. They rode north into the foothills, following old Ephraim's directions, searching for sandstone cliffs and a boy who should have been dead months ago. The search party found him on the 3rd day. They had ridden through the worst of the storm, stopping only when the horses could go no further, huddling together for warmth in whatever shelter they could find. Frostbite claimed the tip of Tobias's nose and both of Harrigan's earlobes. One of the horses collapsed and had to be abandoned. On the morning of the 3rd day, they saw it, a wisp of gray rising from a cliff face, so faint it might have been imagination, so steady it could only be real. Smoke from a fire, heat from a dwelling, signs of life where no life should exist. They approached the cliffs with hearts pounding. The entrance to the cave was nearly invisible, a dark gap in the red-gold stone. It sheltered beneath an overhang, protected by a wooden door that fit perfectly into the rock. Tobias dismounted on trembling legs and walked to the door. He raised his fist, hesitated, and knocked. Silence. Then the sound of movement inside, a bar being lifted, and the door swung inward. Ezra Jessup stood in the entrance to his stone home. He was thin but not starving. His face was windburned but healthy. His dark hair had grown longer, tied back with a strip of leather. He wore a coat made of rabbit fur, stitched together with rawhide, and his hands bore the calluses of someone who had worked stone for months. Behind him, warmth and light, carved walls glowing in firelight, stacks of firewood against the back, bundles of dried meat hanging from pegs, a gray horse nickering softly in an adjoining chamber. The child who should have been a frozen corpse was standing before them, healthy and calm, master of a home they could not have imagined. "You came," Ezra said. It was not a question. Then he added something that made every man's blood run cold. "I have been expecting you for 6 weeks. I prepared extra chambers in the nearby caves. I mapped the Elk Valleys. I gathered enough knowledge to save 100 people, because I knew that when the snow stopped falling, whoever survived would need somewhere to go." The men stared at him in stunned silence. "You knew we would come begging?" Harrigan whispered. "I knew the winter would teach you what I could not. I knew pride would break before starvation did. I knew that somewhere in Briarwood someone would remember the boy you cast out. and wonder if he might still be alive. He stepped back from the door, his face unreadable. I did not prepare because I forgave you. I prepared because letting children die for their parents' arrogance is not something I could live with. Come inside. We have much to do. The interior of the cave was unlike anything the men had imagined. Ezra had carved a dwelling from solid rock, a space of unexpected comfort in the heart of the wilderness. The main chamber measured 12 feet deep and 10 feet wide, with walls smoothed by months of patient labor, a ceiling that peaked at 7 feet, and a floor leveled and packed with careful attention. A fire burned in a pit near the entrance, its smoke rising through a natural chimney crack. The stone around the fire pit radiated warmth, keeping the entire cave at a temperature that felt miraculous after days of brutal cold. Storage alcoves held supplies that should have been impossible for a single child to accumulate: dried rabbit meat in neat bundles, pine nuts in woven grass containers, rose hips for tea, roots that could be roasted or boiled, firewood stacked in precise rows, enough to last for months. Ghost stood in his stable chamber, watching the strangers with nervous eyes, his gray coat gleaming in the firelight. The men stood in the center of this space, steam rising from their frozen clothing, and they stared at the boy who had created all of this. Thaddeus Harrigan was the first to speak. He dropped to his knees on the stone floor, his proud face crumbling, tears freezing on his cheeks before they could fall. I called you a liar, he said, his voice breaking. I voted to send you away. I said if the winter came, I would bring you back myself and build you a house. I said it as a joke. And now I'm kneeling in the house you built for yourself, begging you to save the people who wanted you dead. Jedediah Pike held up his bandaged hands, the stumps of his missing fingers still seeping through the cloth. I bet $5 you were already dead, he said quietly. I laughed when they cast you out. Now I've lost 2 fingers and nearly lost my life. I was wrong. We were all wrong. Dr. Cornelius Webb stood apart from the others, his educated face pale with shame. He had not knelt. He had not wept. But when Ezra's eyes found his, the doctor spoke in a voice stripped of all its former arrogance. I told everyone there was no scientific basis for your predictions. I called your knowledge superstition. I said you were mentally disturbed. I have 3 medical degrees. I have read more books than anyone in this territory. And an 11-year-old boy who learned from watching animals knew more about survival than everything I studied in all those years. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply stated a fact, and the fact hung in the air like smoke. Tobias stood apart from the others, watching Ezra with eyes that held something like hope. I always believed you, he said. My father believed you too. He died saying your name, telling me to find you. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of the fire. Then Ezra spoke. My father had a saying, prepare or perish. The wilderness gives no second chances to those who ignore its warnings. But I am not the wilderness. He looked at each man in turn. There is a valley 3 miles east of here. The elk winter there. The snow is not as deep because of how the cliffs block the wind. If your hunters go there, they will find game. And there are caves in these cliffs, natural ones, large enough to shelter families. The stone holds heat. People can survive there until spring if they are willing to work. Harrigan looked up. You would help us? After what we did? The children in Briarwood did not vote to cast me out. The babies who are hungry did not call me a demon. I will not let the innocent die to punish the guilty. He moved toward the entrance. Rest here tonight. Warm yourselves. Eat. Tomorrow we ride to Briarwood and we bring the survivors back. Every one of them. Even the ones who hate me most. The evacuation of Briarwood began 3 days later. Ezra led them himself, riding Ghost at the head of a column of desperate refugees. Women carrying infants wrapped in every piece of cloth they owned, children stumbling through snowdrifts that reached their waists, men hauling whatever supplies they had managed to save. 112 people, all that remained of a community that had numbered 135, following an 11-year-old boy through passes and trails that no adult had ever noticed, toward caves and sheltered valleys that no one but Ezra knew existed. He organized them with an authority that no one questioned. Families were assigned to caves based on their size and the number of children they had. Hunting parties were formed and directed to the Elk Valley, where they found game exactly as Ezra had promised. Foraging teams learned to dig for roots and nuts that the boy showed them, food sources they had walked past 1,000 times without recognizing. He taught them everything: how to seal a cave entrance against drafts, how to build a fire that heated stone rather than just air, how to smoke meat so it would last for months, how to read the weather signs that indicated when it was safe to venture out and when it was death to try. The knowledge that Silas Jessup had spent a lifetime accumulating, passed to his son through years of patient teaching, was now distributed to an entire community. Mrs. Prudence Olson, who had called Ezra "poor thing" with such theatrical sympathy, who had spread whispers about his troubled mind, now worked in silence alongside the other women. She did not meet Ezra's eyes. She did not offer excuses or apologies. But late one night, when she thought no one was watching, she left a small bundle outside the entrance to Ezra's cave. Inside was a wool scarf, hand-knitted, and a note that said only, "For the winter that taught me to be quiet." Ezra found it the next morning. He wore that scarf for the rest of his life. Temperance Thornwood approached Ezra on the second day of the evacuation. She had left her husband behind in Briarwood, choosing survival over obedience, choosing the wisdom of a child over the pride of a preacher. She sank to her knees in the snow. "Forgive me," she said. "I knew you were right. I knew they were wrong. But I said nothing. I did nothing. I was a coward." Ezra looked at her for a long moment. "You are here," he finally said. "You are alive. 'Cause you chose to come. That is enough. But there was one person who did not come. This is the moment of reckoning. If this story has touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And stay with me, because the ending will stay with you long after the video ends." Reverend Obadiah Thornwood had refused to join the evacuation. He had stood in the door of his church, the building where he had preached for 20 years, the building where he had condemned an 11-year-old boy for the crime of telling the truth. "I will not follow a child I condemned," he had declared. "If God wants me to die, I will die in his house. If God wants me to live, he will provide for me here. I do not need the help of Satan's servant." Temperance had begged him to come. She had wept and pleaded, but Obadiah had been immovable. "Harry, go if you must," he had told her, "but know that you are choosing the devil's path over the path of righteousness." In the end, she had gone. She had looked back once, at the tall figure standing in the church doorway, and then she had turned away and walked north with the others. She never saw her husband alive again. They found his body in April, when the spring thaw finally allowed a party to return to Briarwood. He was sitting in the front pew of his church, his Bible clutched in frozen hands, his face turned toward the altar. He had not died of cold. He had died of starvation, slowly over weeks, refusing to leave his sanctuary even as his body consumed itself. There was no food in the church, no water that had not frozen solid, no warmth except what his dying body had provided. He had sat there in the dark, praying to empty pews, even waiting for a miracle that never came. They buried him in the church graveyard, with a service led by no one, because there was no one left who believed in the words he had preached. The gathering came in May, when the snow had finally retreated and the survivors had returned to what remained of Briarwood. They assembled in the open air, near the ruins of homes that had collapsed under the weight of snow, near the graves of those who had not survived. Tobias Mercer spoke first. He was 16 now, aged beyond his years. "We sent a child into the wilderness to die," he said, his voice steady despite the tears on his face. "We called him a liar when he told us the truth. We cast him out because he made us uncomfortable, because he knew things we didn't understand, because it was easier to blame him than to listen." He turned to Ezra, who stood apart from the group, ghost reins in his hand. "Ezra Jessup saved us. Every one of us standing here owes our life to a boy we treated as less than human." Others spoke, the mothers whose children had survived, the hunters who had found game where Ezra directed them, the families who had sheltered in caves he had shown them. Verity Henderson stood last. She had lost her husband and her baby in the same winter. She had watched her world collapse into grief and despair. Now she faced the boy who had saved her despite having every reason to let her die. "My husband froze to death 20 feet from our door," she said, her voice hollow. "My baby died in my arms because we had no food, no warmth, no hope, all because we didn't listen to you." She stepped closer to Ezra. You had every right to let me die. And you had every right to turn us all away. But you didn't. You saved us. Her voice broke. Why? After everything we did to you, why did you help us? Ezra did not answer immediately. He looked at Verity Henderson, at the hollow spaces in her eyes where hope used to live, at the way her hands trembled even though the spring sun was warm. When I was 9 years old, he said quietly, I buried my father with my own hands. I dug for 2 days until my fingers bled. And when I finished, I made a promise. I promised that what he taught me would not die with him. He paused. My father never said, only save the people who deserve it. He never said, let the children of your enemies starve. He said, the knowledge is a gift. Gifts are meant to be given. Ezra knelt beside the weeping woman, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. Us, your baby did not vote to cast me out. Your husband did not stand in the church and call me a demon. They died because others made choices for them. The children in those caves, the women who carried them through the snow, the old people too weak to walk, they are not my enemies. They are just people. And people, unlike mountains, can change. He helped Verity to her feet. You asked why I saved you. The truth is simpler than you think. I saved you because I could. Because my father's voice in my head said, the boy who lets innocence die to punish the guilty is no better than the guilty themselves. Because the mountains taught me to survive, but my father taught me what survival is for. Verity fell to her knees again, weeping for the first time since her husband's death. Ezra knelt beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder, was saying nothing, simply being present for a woman who had lost everything and was only now beginning to feel the weight of that loss. When she finally rose, she spoke again. I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the mercy you showed me. Ezra nodded slowly. I do not forgive what happened. Forgiveness is not something I know how to give. Perhaps I will learn someday. Perhaps I never will. But I am glad you lived. I am glad the children lived. I am glad that when the winter tried to kill everyone in its path, we chose to be something other than the winter. The town of Briarwood was rebuilt, but it was never the same. The cattle industry that had sustained it was broken. The community that rose from the ashes was smaller, humbler, more careful. They diversified their food sources. And they built stronger shelters. They stockpiled provisions against the winters they now knew could come without warning. And they listened. When the old-timers spoke of weather signs, of animal behavior, of the patterns that predicted what was coming, people listened. When children asked questions that seemed strange, parents answered instead of dismissing. When someone warned of danger, the community prepared instead of mocking. The phrase, listening to the animals, entered the vocabulary of the Wyoming rangelands. It meant paying attention to signs that nature provided, trusting warnings that came from sources others might dismiss. It was spoken with quiet respect, as if the speaker remembered what happened to those who failed to listen. Ezra did not return to live among them. He stayed in his cliff home, expanding it over the years into a complex of chambers that could shelter 30 people if needed. He became a guide for those crossing the mountains, a teacher for those who wanted to learn the old skills, a living reminder that the wilderness demanded respect. He never married, but he was never alone. Children from Briarwood came to learn from him. First a few, then dozens over the years. Young people who wanted to understand what he understood, who were willing to spend weeks in the mountains absorbing the knowledge that Silas Jessup had passed to his son. They called themselves Ezra's students, and they spread across the territory, carrying his teachings wherever they went. Tobias Mercer became the first of these students. He spent 3 summers learning everything Ezra could teach him, and then he returned to Briarwood to share that knowledge with others. He built a school where children learned not just reading and writing, but the old skills, the survival skills, the wisdom of people who had learned to live with the land rather than against it. Old Ephraim Morrison died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79, having lived to see his warnings validated and his memories honored. His last words were to his great-grandson, a boy of 10 who had just returned from his first summer with Ezra. Remember what you learned up there, the old man had whispered. Remember that nature tells the truth, even when people lie. Verity Henderson remarried 3 years after the Great Winter to a widower from a neighboring town who had lost his own family in the same catastrophe. Together they raised 5 children. In Eros, she named her second son Thomas after the husband she had lost, and she named her third son Ezra after the boy who had given her the chance to love again. Ghost, the gray Mustang, lived to the remarkable age of 26. He died in his sleep in the summer of 1904, his body finally giving out after years of faithful service. Ezra buried him near the entrance to the cave. In a grave he dug himself, just as he had dug his father's grave so many years before. The headstone was simple, carved from the same sandstone that formed the walls of their home. Ghost, companion, never abandoned me. And in the years that followed, wolves never attacked Ezra or any of his students traveling through the mountains. The packs gave them wide berth, circling around rather than challenging, retreating rather than attacking. People said it was because of a gray she-wolf that Ezra had saved during his first winter alone. A wolf that had somehow communicated to her kind that this human was different. Perhaps it was true. Perhaps it was legend. Perhaps, like so many things in Ezra's life, it was both. Ezra Jessup died in the winter of 1949 at the age of 74. He passed peacefully in his sleep, in the stone home he had carved with his own hands 63 years before. The walls still held warmth from the fire that had burned in the same pit for more than 6 decades. The entrance still bore the wooden door he had built from fallen aspens. The stable where Ghost had once stood was empty now, but the shape of the horse seemed to linger in the shadows. His students found him in the morning, his face peaceful, his hands folded across his chest, his eyes closed as if he had simply decided to rest and never wake up. They buried him beside his father, in the grave Ezra had dug when he was 9 years old. The knife that had dug that grave, the knife that Tobias Mercer had given him on the day of his exile, was passed to his most dedicated student, who passed it to the next generation, and the next, a chain of knowledge and remembrance that continues to this day. The Cliff home still exists, protected now as a historical site, maintained by descendants of the students Ezra taught. Visitors come from across the country to see the carved chambers, the fire pit, the stable where Ghost once stood. They come to understand how a child survived what should have killed him, and then chose to save the people who had tried to let him die. Above the entrance, carved in letters that Ezra added sometime in the years after the Great Winter, is an inscription that visitors often photograph, often share, often remember long after they have returned to their ordinary lives. It reads, "The mountains told me, I told them. Now we all know." His father Silas, who had taught him to listen when no one else would have recognized the truth in every word. Thank you for watching this story about Ezra Jessup and the stone home of Wyoming. When we silence those who warn us, we often find ourselves dependent on their mercy. When we cast out the voices that make us uncomfortable, we sometimes discover that those voices were trying to save us. Ezra could have let them die. He could have sat in his warm cave, knowing that the people who had called him a liar were freezing and starving 20 miles to the south. No one would have blamed him. But he chose differently. He chose to share what he knew. He chose to save the people who had hurt him. He chose to be something more than the mountains that had taught him to survive. Because in the end, survival is not enough. We must also be human. We must also show mercy. We must also hope that when we make mistakes, when we fail to listen, someone will give us a second chance. Ezra gave Briarwood that chance, and they used it to build something better. If this story reminded you that wisdom can come from the most unexpected sources, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Techie, and tell me in the comments, has anyone ever punished you for telling a truth they didn't want to hear? How did it change you? The mountains are still out there, teaching their lessons to anyone willing to learn. The question is whether we will listen or whether we will have to learn the hard way. Ezra listened. His father taught him to listen. And because of that, 89 people lived who should have died, and their children lived,